Today we got about 30 minutes, so if you guys can pay attention, take notes. We are going to finish up the Mesopotamian architecture, and then we are going to orient ourselves to Egypt. Okay, so this is where we left off the other day. So this is a continuation of Mesopotamia. So if you think back to the first slide in this series, I think I'll take you guys all there for just a moment, or one of the first slides. All right, not the locational ones, but this one right here. Right, you remember that there are 4 periods that we're sort of considering stylistically as part of Mesopotamia. Okay, and so what I want to do now is jump forward to where we left off. It's right there. So the third of these eras is called the New Babylonian Empire, or the Babylonian New Empire. Okay, Babylon existed back with the very, very first Sumerians, I believe. It was conquered by Assyria, and then when Assyria fell, the Assyrian kings that were in Babylon maintained authority there. Okay, and they chose to sort of give up a lot of the characteristics of the Assyrians. So the Assyrian kings of Babylon, after most of Assyria had fallen to other tribes and peoples, had essentially decided, you know what, we're going to get rid of that. And if you remember, we talked about the fact that the Assyrians were warriors, right, and hunters. They were manly men, correct? And like manly men, they weren't very organized, right? They weren't very subtle. They weren't very elegant. Well, the Assyrian kings that remained in Babylon were essentially influenced by Sumerian cultures to the point that they created a new empire based upon those early Sumerian Babylonian principles. Okay? And so those of you that have done any kind of research in biblical Old Testament sort of reading, you probably are familiar with the name called Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? So Nebuchadnezzar was one of the kings that established Babylon. This is I believe, Renaissance era painting, right? That is by I believe, a Renaissance era painter that is a depiction of the Tower of Babel. Okay, I don't know that that's exactly what it looked like. I'm not sure what the origins of this painting are or how they depicted it. It's probably coming out of mythology, but within biblical references, there are links to the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel was probably a ziggurat. Okay? Remember that the ziggurats go back to the Sumerians. They're the ones that sort of invented the whole idea of the ziggurat. So here we see sort of 2 plans of the Babylonian city, or a portion of the Babylonian city, showing the walls and all of the different gates that come into the city, okay? Because it was a walled city, and it had these very, very sort of specific gates that faced out in various directions, all right? So the city was fortified with a wall so that it could be protected, all right? One of the things that you'll see in your reading is that this wall was so impressive, right, that they could hoist chariots up onto it with dual horses, and 2 chariots could pass each other on top of the wall. Okay? So I want you to pay particular attention to the one that says the Ishtar Gate, because the Ishtar Gate we're going to reference in further sort of slides. So these are some modern day views, one of these is the modern day view of what's left of Babylon. This is actually after many, many wars and many, many thousands of years. You can actually see Saddam Hussein's palace was built on the site of Babylon. That's this thing right here.
Was it built above it?
Built in it. It was built inside. So I don't know if you can read that, but that says Saddam's palace. right? This is what's left of the southern palace of Nebuchadnezzar, right? And somewhere in here, right there, is the Ishtar Gate, okay? And there are still remnants of the Ishtar Gate visible today. This other image, right, is actually upside down, so I should probably spin it around, I believe. Actually, no. I should put this one in upside down, okay? Because it probably should have been oriented to the one that has the north arrow on it. So this one, I believe, has south facing up, okay? But what you'll find is that the archaeological remains, they've discovered where the processional way, where some of the main processional ways were that entered the Ishtar Gate. Okay? And this whole idea that we've just covered about axes links to the notion of a procession. How many of you guys have ever gone to a wedding? Anybody ever gone to a wedding? None of you, or all of you? All of you have been to a wedding? Right? How many of you graduated from high school? Anybody? Y'all did. Do you guys remember that there was a procession? Right? Do you guys, both at the wedding and at graduation, there's a procession, there's a sequence. And those processions generally followed along some form of a line. Well, the New Babylonians they had various processional ways that aligned at that 90-degree angle to these gates that entered the city. Okay? And there are various ceremonies that you'll read about in the text that you'll find on Canvas about the ceremonies, and I believe there's going to be one additional reading out of a website that talks about that. Okay? So let's continue on. This next thing is a digital artist reconstruction of Babylon. Okay? And you can start to get an idea that this was not a small city. This was a major, major city. The construction was so major that they literally dug canals and moats, right, on the outsides of the walls. There were these waterways that entered through various locations. And so in the middle there, you see the ziggurat, okay? I don't know if the Tower of Babel is, I think it's out of the frame here, because I think the ziggurat might be different. No, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are the other sort of element. Anyway, so here is a piece of the Babylon Ishtar Gate. And you can see that it's made out of bricks. These bricks are more sophisticated than the bricks from the early Sumerians, right? These are fired bricks. And in the case of these things, they actually had a pigmentation, a ceramic pigmentation that was fired onto them. So this formed the Ishtar Gate that we've just been referencing along the primary ceremonious path. And here you see an image of that ceremonious path, the entrance to the city or out of the city. It's actually going into the city, because you see the ziggurat up in the upper right-hand corner over in here. And you see a procession marching into the city through the Ishtar Gate. Now, the Ishtar Gate was actually a portion of the Ishtar Gate was completely reconstructed, and I believe it's from original materials in the museum in Berlin, okay? And there is an actual you have the actual ability to walk through the Ishtar Gate, right? And so remember that these things are dating back to thousands of years. So to be able to actually stand in a piece of history is quite impressive, okay? So that's just a sort of a synopsis of the new Babylonian Empire, which is the third of the Mesopotamian cultures. There's several additional things that we can go into, but the lecture would get too long. So some of you have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, right? Which I don't know that they have found remnants of. They may have found what may have been the foundations for it, okay? But they had very sort of sophisticated, sort of aesthetic, how do you say it? Sort of an aesthetic sense. Very different than the Assyrians, right? Even though they were Assyrians, they were very different than the majority of the Assyrians that came before them. All right? The fourth of the cultures that make up our discussion and our study of Mesopotamia is Persia. Okay, So Persia conquered a massive empire by about 500 BC. They conquered the Assyrians. Okay, their empire stretched all the way up through Turkey and into Asia. So they actually conquered a very large area, much larger than the Mesopotamians had originally occupied. So there were two great kings, and actually there were a lot of kings, but two of them that stand out as having built architecture were Darius and Xerxes. Xerxes. I have a hard time pronouncing some of these names. These two kings, one after the other, built this palace, okay, at Persepolis. And the intent of that palace was to kind of show how powerful they were, to show how sophisticated they were. One of the interesting things is that the Persian architecture didn't really invent new stuff. They brought stuff together from all sorts of places. And one of the things that makes it unique is that even though it's this mishmash of influences, that they modified them and put them together in such a way that it holds together cohesively. Okay? The Persians were so powerful that at one point they almost overran what we would call Western culture, which is where our heritage comes from in the West. Okay? The United States came from Europe, or initially came from Europe, and our culture is very closely tied to the European cultures, right? And the European cultures developed beginning with the notion of Greece. And if you want to think about the fact that democracy, right, goes back to the Greeks and the Romans, all right, things could have gone very differently with the exception of a battle between the Greeks and the Persians that occurred in 490 BC. All right, and the Greeks essentially, it was Alexander the Great, I believe it was Alexander the Great, that stopped the Persians from crossing across the Aegean into to Greece. Okay, so let's take a look a little bit at the Persian sort of stuff. Same as the earlier things that we saw. Things were built on large platforms. This time the platforms were built out of stone. Okay. Most of the structures that we're looked at had basically non-religious pieces, all right? And a lot of them are divided into what's called a tripartite arrangement. It's an arrangement of three, okay? So when we look at the palace, you'll find that there are living quarters, there's a great hall, and then the entrance and gateways. So don't forget, they also had harems. So, one of the things that you see here that you didn't see in the early Sumerian constructions was that it was an architecture of columns. It was a columnist architecture. Okay? Remember we talked about in the early Sumerian part where they didn't really use a lot of columns, right? It was mostly walls and they didn't span very far because the mud brick couldn't span very far. They, on the other hand, developed columns and they developed lintels that could span across the columns and could create enclosures that had wider openings. And they also felt that the columns were a way of expressing their glory and their power. All right. So let's take a look at where the Persian Empire existed. And so again, this is going to go back to this cognitive mapping that I'm asking you guys to look at. So you can see here the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean, correct? And so that's the area that we've been looking at. And if you look at it, the Persians actually moved into Egypt. So at one point, they conquered portions of Egypt, and they were stopped, right, up at Macedonia by the Greeks. Otherwise, we may not have democracy. We may not have our form of government. So, all right, so continuing on from that, it's important that you guys kind of see it's important that you guys start to sort of visually understand where was the initial Mesopotamia, right? Here's the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? Remember, there was the Fertile Crescent that came off to the side there, But now look at the rest of this empire. Look at this, look at that, and look at this portion in Egypt. So these guys were powerful. All right, so let's take a look at that palace that we were talking about, the Palace of Persepolis. And so here is an artist's rendering, not a rendering, but a drawing. I believe this one came out of potentially out of your book. All right, and you can see the platform, the stone platform that it was built upon. And you can see the structures kind of up on top of it. I'm sure that right now you should be able to quickly start to see axial alignments, right? And things marking points in space. So for example, here's a gateway, correct? That's demarking a point in space. And what did I say? There was a cross axis that went through it, right?
Can't see your mouse. Yeah,
oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong side. So let's find my mouse. There it is. So right here is a gateway, right? And there's an axis line implied, and I'm sure that this thing, right, is kind of aligning with it. And then there was another axis that's created by this gateway and another axis that's created by these structures. Now let's take a quick look at a plan, right? And this plan is turned from what we were looking at, but you can start to see, the various palaces and the sort of column areas that were essentially filled with columns. Okay, because remember, they and the cultures that came before them did not have access to major spanning systems. And you guys are taking it for granted that you're standing in a room right now that has no columns, and it's no columns for 35, 40 feet. And you guys have all driven under freeway bridges that are spanning hundreds of feet. So those are all sort of modern constructs. Back in the days of the ancients, they didn't have those things. Okay? Eventually, ancient peoples would start to develop ways of spanning larger distances, but not at this time. And so you can see that a lot of the spaces are made up of a lot of columns. Okay? So here is the ruins of Persepolis, and you can actually go to these ruins. They're in Iraq, I believe. And I'm sorry?
I'm saying, do they have a roof or?
No, that's what's left. And actually,
Original.
Yes.
originally, yeah, this is that.
Oh, yeah.
So 15 minutes.
We're at 15 already?
Yeah.
Oh, right. All right, I'm gonna stop it.
You ready? Once again, it's mapping. Yeah. So look that up.
Right.